around since the 60s, but in recent years, researchers observed persistently inequitable patterns of participation, particularly in high tariff courses and particularly in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This has been attributed in research to various things, including the cumulative nature of STEM learning, meaning it's sort of a ladder of learning and you can't jump steps, and more rigid entry requirements for students, and those two are connected. So rigidity here means that institutions are less flexible in tailoring their entry requirements to students' educational and social backgrounds. Researchers criticised high tariff institutions for not doing enough to widen participation, and it's highlighted in particular a conflict between discourses of meritocracy, which focus on selecting the highest attaining students, and equitable discourses that require that students' attainment is considered in conjunction and in the context of their educational and socioeconomic background. My study focuses in very specifically on these conflicting discourses and the connected concepts of potential and ability that are central in admissions. In order to do this, I've chosen to focus on mathematics, and that isn't because I'm a mathematician. I'm not, although I have worked a lot in finance and banking where a lot of quantitative graduates work. However, I'm focusing on mathematics and also on the most competitive universities for maths in England. I think this section of higher education deserves a particular scrutiny because both women and disadvantaged students are particularly underrepresented. I've put this little picture on. It came actually from a kids' website, Kids Maths Games Online, just to remind us what mathematicians look like or historically what they've looked like. So in order to examine the elite level within higher education, I've had to define a group of elite mathematics universities. And I've done that with reference to their rankings in various rankings and surveys, and also with reference to their entry requirements, admissions tests they use, and to a lesser extent, graduate pay in the courses. And I've ended up with 4 universities in my group. And I have, through my interviews with participants, I've checked that they align with what participants think are the elite universities, and that does seem to be the case. So having formed that group, I can then compare the participation of women and disadvantaged students, that's socioeconomically disadvantaged students, on the elite courses compared to maths courses across England. So here I've got some data which shows that participation on elite courses is lower, and in some cases really very low. So with the disadvantaged data there, that I've picked up Polar 1 and 2. So if they were proportionally represented, my understanding is that there would be 40% of them. And obviously the participation of women on some courses at this elite level is extremely low. So other reasons for focusing on elite courses is the pathways between elite courses and elite professions and the associated power and earnings potential that leads to. And another reason for focusing on mathematics is the emphasis in admissions on these admissions tests, which form a barrier to entry and which conveniently, from a research perspective, embody ability concepts, which can then be opened up and examined. So when I was in school in the 90s, only Oxford and Cambridge had admissions tests. But since then, they've been introduced by a number of other universities, and they now go across a range of different subjects. There's a trend towards admissions tests increasing, and students need to sit these tests to gain access to a whole range of subjects in universities. And reflecting this, there's a support industry of both in-person and online tutoring, which is profiting from these tests and benefiting the well-resourced, which is a concern and one of the reasons why I've designed my study in this way. So in my group of 4 elite universities, they all use admissions tests, but just for your reference, there are 3 different mathematics admissions tests used by the different universities, and sometimes they change over time. And students make choices about universities who might be requiring different tests. So when I was, if we look at how I've designed my study, my overall aim in my study is to interrogate how power, knowledge, and resistance operate through discourses of ability in elite mathematics and the effects that these have on individuals and on patterns of participation in this area. So in terms of the methodology, a lot of widening participation, WP research is quantitative. That's really how the research area has been built on quantitative methods and statistics because they're excellent at illuminating overall patterns. But the flip side is that they struggle to understand what's driving those patterns. So my study is qualitative. It's based in a constructionist and post-structural framework, reflecting Foucault's understanding of discourse as social practices that constitute the social reality and govern individuals. So practically, this is what I've done. I've interviewed 45 people involved in elite mathematics higher education in England. And some widening participation interview studies have, or a lot of interviewed admission staff and tutors. So I've widened that to focus, well, I've narrowed it to focus on just mathematics, and then I've widened to speak to a wider range of people to gather different discourses so that I can map them out. So I've spoken to these people at this group of 4 elite universities, and I've also spoken to outreach and third sector individuals who are involved in assisting disadvantaged students in gaining access to this area. I've spoken to them about these things. So what have I spoken about? I've spoken to them about school, how they developed mathematicians, applying to university admissions tests and university mathematics in order to explore these discourses. So my study is situated at the transition point between school and university, and many of the findings that are emerging in my study, because I'm only 2 years into my 3-year study, relate to the provision of mathematics education in schools and the nature and sources of mathematical educational disadvantage. But today I'm focusing on the findings that relate to higher education, and reflecting the theme of the conference, I'm focusing specifically on resistant discourses that are emerging in my study. So I'm going to pull out a few findings. My first relates to student resistance to the tests themselves. When speaking to students about their university choices, students clearly say these were directly impacted by the admissions tests. When students speak about their choices, they first speak about the hierarchy of universities, they speak about the rankings, and then they secondly speak about the admissions tests. And then less frequently, some of them speak about role models, relations, and friends. So the admissions tests are central to their decision-making process, and they assessed how accessible the tests were by looking at past papers and trying questions. They say things like this: I was put off by the test. The test was ridiculously hard. I wouldn't have wanted to do it alongside my A-levels. I didn't do it. So it affects where they apply, or rather the tests affect where they apply. So in general, the student participants, they understand and they respect the purpose of the tests. They even enjoy the mathematics that's in the tests on the whole. But only students and teachers, out of my four groups of people, only students and teachers drew on discourses of time and risk in conjunction with the tests and applying to university. These discourses were absent in the interviews with university lecturers and largely absent with outreach and third sector individuals. And this is pertinent to the ability concept in elite mathematics, with practice and time being required to succeed in the tests. This undermines the idea that the tests focus solely on mathematical ability. So in summary, students are influenced by admissions tests in selecting universities, and even among the very high achieving group of students in my study, students opt out of admissions tests which they deem too difficult. And in my study, I characterize this as resistance to a system which they deem unreasonable. And I believe that this resistance is part of what shapes the patterns of participation in this area. So who does this affect? As I've mentioned, highly resourced students can access a range of tutoring support, but they're also more likely to be taught by teachers from elite university backgrounds who are more able and willing to teach these tests. This is not a common skill. And in addition, highly resourced students are more likely to be in a school with ability setting and grouping, which facilitates accelerated pathways through the school curriculum, providing time at school to practice for tests. So that's disadvantaged students. In terms of women, the picture's more complicated to explain. It's going to take longer, but it's fair to say that female pupils do less well in these admissions tests than male pupils. And for the universities that rely heavily on the admissions tests for selection, i.e. not in conjunction with other things, they have lower female offer rates. So at one of the universities in my group, the female offer rate is 12% compared to 19% for male students. So, and what's interesting as well is that this is well known by female students. It's part of the discourse around elite mathematics that women don't do very well on these tests. And it raises the question of how many girls opt out of these tests and of trying to enter the elite universities for mathematics. So my next finding also relates to women. Women have become more central to my study than I expected. To begin with, I was more focused on socioeconomic disadvantage, but women spoke to me a lot. They more participated than would be proportionate in the elite maths area. This is one of the things they said. This is women resisting the stereotype of who participates in elite maths. They say that they describe it as a resistant activity, something that wasn't expected of them, and in some cases, something that they are actively told they weren't suitable for. So some students cite this as an important motivating factor, but on the flip side of that, it's likely that others simply take other routes. So once they get on the course, the resistance continues. The theme of resistance continues because they start to resist what they refer to as a competitive culture. So they describe a culture which doesn't suit them as women, but in which they persevere. So their main issue with the culture is a competitive and sometimes arrogant attitude from some male students, which manifests itself in an individualistic and non-collaborative approach to work. This is some of the things that they say. They talk about hyper-competition, not being able to ask questions, being mansplained to, and how that affects their confidence in mathematics and on their courses. Some female students switch off, and this has an impact both on the students themselves and the ones that are left on the courses. So female students resist the culture in various ways. They talk to me about opting out of problem sessions where they have been allocated into groups which they find competitive and non-collaborative. And they speak about opting out of lectures where lecturers fail to communicate things. This quote here, "I never went to the board," is very interesting. She's talking about a whiteboard in a problem class during the course. She never went to the board. And I smile wryly because this is one of the most high achieving women students in my study. And she said she didn't have the balls. She never went to the board. So women students articulate a shared awareness that the courses and admission systems don't work for women, and they draw on discourses of resignation and acceptance of the situation. and they form informal groups outside of their formal groups that are made up of allies and people that they can speak to about their maths and the problems that they're facing. One of the students in my study went further and published an article in a university magazine about mathematics, why women didn't enter it, why they don't pass the admissions test, why they switch off onto other courses. But in her view, this didn't come to anything. And in speaking to her, she drew on discourses of exhaustion and a need for recovery, giving the impression that her resistance, or the resistance that she'd mounted during her course, had taken its toll on her both mentally and physically. So just finally now, I just want to look at lecturer discourses. Now, there's a particular sort of lecturer that features quite a lot in my study. They tend to be very experienced. They've done a number of decades in the role, and they've done some admissions responsibilities, and they explain why the status quo is as it is. These are some of the things that they draw on. These are a summary rather than quotations. They say, we've tried different things and they don't work. We don't know what to do. Women don't want to come. They lack confidence. And yes, there are some arrogant male students on our course, but it would be unfair to exclude them because they're very good at mathematics. So they draw on an equitable discourse, in fact, to justify the inclusion of these types of students without recognizing or connecting that these students and the way that they behave might be impacting the culture and other students. So finally, whilst it is easy to criticize that, there are female students in my study that have communicated very clearly with me that there are pockets of resistance within the lecturer group that are pushing back against the discourses of what maths is and how maths should be at university. And these are examples of what female participants have said about champions in the WP area, sort of hidden within these elite institutions. And I think that underlines how difficult it is to resist dominant discourses in this area that have been constructed over many, many years. So finally, in terms of next steps and what I'm interested in coming out of my study, I think that scrutinizing the impact of tests is really important, and the ability concepts that are hidden within them. And I think focusing on one subject has been fruitful, and it has allowed the consideration of women, which is a group that is normally outside of the widening participation agenda. So thank you very much, and I'd be very happy to hear any comments that you have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Beth, for a fantastic presentation. So yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions. So does anyone have any questions for Beth at all? Kirsty.
Just wanted to share, sorry, Kirsty, do you want to go first?
That's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
After you.
Okay. So, Beth, I studied in an all-girls school in New Delhi, and I never realized like what studying in an all-girls, and it was an elite school, did the kind of confidence about doing STEM. And when I reached university, I went to an all-girls college. Again, it's ranked first in India in terms of history and excellence. And I did physics there for 3 years. And then I went to my master's degree where we had a bunch of 100 students and from all over the city and the country. And my confidence dipped the moment I stepped into that heterosexual, diverse classroom. And suddenly, the anecdote you shared from the student, that I just didn't have the balls to walk up to the whiteboard. All my life, I had developed, I never thought about it, that you would volunteer and you would do problem solving in a theoretical physics class. And suddenly you were with, these high achieving other students. And suddenly you felt engulfed with self-doubt. And those 2 years, just the way you shared, it brought back the question of, how non-feminine the academic spaces for STEM how discouraging they end up becoming
Mm.
in subtle ways. So I think it's a very, I just thought I'll share that.
Thank you. That's so interesting for you to share. And it is very interesting, the single sex environment, because you can become yourself and build your confidence within a single sex environment. But at some point, you were going to have to translate that to, yeah, to the real world. And that is potentially you're going to come across difficulties. I was blown away with the accomplishment of some of the females that took part in the study, in terms of who they were, what they've done, how they've competed to gain their places on these courses, sometimes from an international cohort of people, and yet they still find the culture very difficult to take part in.
Thank you. Kirsty, you put your hand up earlier and had a question as well.
Bit like Manasi, it's just really a comment. So if anybody has questions, I don't mind them coming in. But my mum is a maths teacher, and just a lot of in a school, and just so much of what you said, it just takes me back. I mean, she went to university to do engineering, but she was a single mum with me, young, and they almost didn't let her in because they didn't think her maths was going to be good enough, because she had to drop her A levels because I was here, and she went to college, so they were worried about her maths. So in that first test, on her maths test that they had to do, she made sure she got full marks just to tell them all, but she had to go for an extra interview because they were worried that, with me having a daughter and her maths, that she wouldn't, and she had to beg and say, I am good enough, I will do this. And she was the first woman to get the engineering award at that university as well. And now she's a maths teacher, and she massively inspires her female students, tries to give them confidence and shares her story with them as well. So that was that sort of side. And then from my perspective, I'm in music, I'm a composer, so in a very male dominated space. When you put the picture up of the mathematics, it could have just been composers, it just looks the same. So having been in a male dominated space, I've done some research around similar, looking at composing in elite universities and conservatoires. And a few slides ago, when we talked to the lecturers about why there's not as many female students, or around the A level doesn't prepare them. I mean, we were doing the same study but on maths and music. It was the same responses, which I thought was just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think what's particularly interesting is we to an extent we think that these things are kind of largely solved, because people say, well, at A-level maths, everything's equal now. Everyone knows women are as good as maths as men are. It's all been equalized. But the thing with the discursive approach is it allows you to connect back to those historically constructed discourses which don't go away. And however we might say, or people think that men and women are equal at mathematics, there's still this point where at the highest level, they'll say, or sometimes I find written in books, at the highest level there are distinctions between male and female mathematics, which is extraordinary. It still exists, but it's still there. These traces sort of carry on, and they still affect us all.
Definitely. And when you said the student didn't want to go up to the board, and I see you shared that as well. For me, with the composers, they have like this sharing session where you have to share a piece in a piece of music that is in process, and then it gets fed back by the whole of the year of what they should do better. And I often work, I teach, and I have female students, and they really share how they're like, this is absolutely terrifying. I do not want to go in that space at all. So trying to trying to then share that with my male colleagues, has been a real challenge. So yeah, I'd love to know. I know you said you're second year into your PhD. I'd love to hear more and send some stuff to my mum as well. She'd appreciate your work in this area. I know she would. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsty. That's really encouraging.
Brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, we've probably out on time. So again, just to say thank you to Beth for a great presentation, and for everyone else for some really great questions and conversation and reflections as well. It's been brilliant to share. Okay, so moving on to our second speaker, if we may, which is Manasi. Welcome. Who's going to be presenting Resisting the Times, Reflections from Case Studies of Critical Voices and Negotiations within the Public Universities in India. So over to you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to share that this is a work in progress. And as I was submitting my PhD thesis in the year 2020, which was on a case study of a leading university in Delhi and its experience with institutional change, I had an opportunity to kind of make the political spectrum or political developments speak to my data. So it's titled Resisting the Times, and what are public universities in India being subject to in terms of the political intervention as a site of deep policy intervention, and how is that visible kind of orthodox intervention of the orthodoxical discourses actually a handmaiden of neoliberal mechanisms. So I'll just walk through very briefly to the context in which the reform discourse in Indian higher education has been set up, and how public universities have become sites of this intense policy intervention that I spoke of. And finally, how does this case study or the experience of one university reflect that the twin forces characterizing the ascendancy of the right wing, both religious conservatism, are going hand in hand with the higher education being converted into a market space, or the development of a higher education market in India. So that's just the brief overview of what the system of higher education in India looks like. And the figures won't speak too much of themselves unless we kind of look at it from the perspective of how 10 years have created a significant difference in the landscape of higher education institutions. The data is collected from Government of India's All India Survey on Higher Education. There has been a policy commitment to expanding higher education towards massification, that is gross enrollment ratio above 25% of the eligible youth population, 18 to 23. We find then that while at 2012 and 2013, there was 209 private universities completely unaided by any government source. This figure comes into perspective even more if we realize that in the year 2000-2001, there wasn't even a single private university in the country. The legislation to introduce higher education to, from a public good to a private commodity to be traded in market was debated intensely in the Indian Parliament in 2000 and rejected outrightly. And yet, within a span of 2 decades, without being an explicit policy, privatization was unfolded. So we find that the state commitment to democratizing access to higher education, that is to open it up to almost a significant proportion of first generation university goers, people who are now able to complete post secondary school education with the implementation of right to education in 2009 in the country. there is a simultaneous attempt by the state to withdraw funding of higher education institutions. So the route to expansion seems contradictory, and in terms of you want to democratize access, but at the same time, the primary vehicle of expansion of access is private institutions. If we look at again, like the share of enrollments of private colleges in India, 63%, as opposed to from 2012 to 64.6 has been a consistent share. There is a distinction in terms of colleges and universities, that colleges are affiliated to universities. So private management colleges, almost 75% at undergraduate level, they're catering to undergraduate education. So that's one primary point, that there is democratization of access as a policy narrative, but the route to that has been privatization. The state has anchored the policy discourse of reforming universities, and particularly reforming public universities, as saying that despite being like on the scale comparable to China, and now surpassing it in terms of enrollment, Indian higher education has faced problems of national coordination, underinvestment, overtly politicized academic culture and academic spaces, under modernized public research universities, and the huge struggle with maintaining standards. So these are kind of identified tropes which international actors as well as research on Indian higher education has signposted. So as I was doing my PhD work on how institutions deal or articulate ideas around reform, I realized that this identification of the problems of the system, or which are systemic problems, are taken on board by the state. They're taken on board by organizations like the University Grants Commission, who are credited with or responsible for reforming the system. And yet, the same problems, instead of being interrogated from the perspective of how the regulatory system needs to improve, have given way to a new discourse, a discourse which discredits the possibility of public institutions providing a viable space for democratizing access. In fact, holding public institutions responsible for the malaise in higher education. So when I was mentioning that 75% enrollments are taken care of by colleges, the idea has been that since colleges are the seats of undergraduate education, so one way to come around what suboptimal public institutions are doing or delivering, or what suboptimal private colleges affiliated to public universities are delivering in the name of undergraduate education, is to not only restructure the curriculum, shift from a uniform degree, which everybody who enters year one graduates with, so to introduce this idea of a flexibility in the in access to higher education with multiple entry and multiple exit points. So very similar to the idea of associate degree, but being implemented within mainstream academic institutions. It has been accompanied in terms of, and this is what the National Education Policy of 2020 has stamped on, that while this restructuring happens at systemic level, new mechanisms of accreditation will be followed, which kind of track academic outputs, but also track the processes in terms of what's being recognized as standard, what is being recognized as matching the standards being set up not by university boards themselves or their academic councils, but standards which are being set externally by state bodies. So these are three elements that there is a move towards digital university, towards creating flexibility in access. And it sounds not very problematic. And the idea of invoking private to address public needs. Where the issue gets complicated is how the same narrative of public institutions being unable to manage themselves and therefore requiring external surveillance and close monitoring has opened ways for integration, or almost like a Trojan horse, allowing new discourses of governance regimes, a discourse around the hyper-nationalist discourse of Indian knowledge systems or Indianization of the curriculum being snuck in, and an identification of a new kind of curricular regimes. So the university that I was collecting my data in, interviewing vice chancellors, faculty, deans of the community, of the academic community, as they reflected on their institutional struggles with respect to the state in resisting implementation of centrally prescribed schemes of curriculum. And it's a span over 2 years that I did my interviews. There was a subtle kind of recognition that that universities are sites of intense political negotiation. So in a pre-social media world, they are the seats of intellectual articulation of dissent, and as well as they are the conscience keeper of society in general. And within that recognition, there is an evidence that while the state feels that the public universities aren't doing much, and at the same time, the state intensively scrutinizes what's going on in the classrooms, who's finding a way into the reading list, right? So a very recent report has found that in the last 10 years, academic freedom in India has significantly decreased. And universities have been, particularly since 2014, become sites of ideological control. And there are two ways to think about it, and I'll come to that in a moment. As public institutions have been ridiculed, particularly since 2014, for lack of quality and for being, for being silos and for being indifferent to quote unquote the concerns of the students, and particularly because public education is free, and therefore an alternative idea has been, or discourse has been peddled, that a fee-paying institution offers greater accountability. So there has been a sustained media attack on public funded institutions by focusing precisely on cultures of resistance that these public institutions have nurtured since India's, even before India's independence, where there were sites of the nationalist movement to be nurtured for independence. And post-independence, they have been the conscience keeper of checking power abuse by the state. So the difference now in the last 10 years has been that the state and the state-supported media has intensified the narrative of research on higher education, identifying in public universities to be marked by inertia, to dispute the possibility and the existence of intellectual scholarship on civil society issues, political issues, within the context and within the site of publicly funded institutions. And it has created or opened up an avenue of deepening institutional paralysis within public institutions in a very short span of time. Just a few excerpts from media reporting on how to do basic scholarship, particularly within liberal arts, has come under scrutiny. A research scholar who cited Noam Chomsky's criticism of the current political regime, not only was his PhD defense failed, it costed his professor his job for including Chomsky as a reference. The same goes with in public institutions, with Foucault being mentioned in your reading list. So these are anecdotal accounts, but they're increasingly finding their way into public domain. one major significant contribution of the university that I was engaging with was its attempt to engage and open up the academic territory to discussions about power imbalance in Indian society and how the academic discourse was not just marked by Western Eurocentric focus and theory, but also by a gaze or lens which is marked by upper caste imagination, by what is called as Brahminization. So caste inequality and gender inequality attempt to include that perspective and to present history bottom up from Indian context has been a great achievement of the last decades of the 90s and early 2000s. And now this current report shows how particular texts which open up scrutiny into addressing power imbalance, social inequality, which challenge the narrative of the current government about of presenting a supremacist discourse, that there is one way to think about Indian society, and there is one way to think about how to be an Indian, which cannot reconcile with the discourses of social justice which universities are introducing students to. So Brahminization as a term which provide a lens to both to history, social theory and literary theory have come under immense, and it seems weird, like why would the state even bother about what's going on in the classrooms? But these are debates over the prescribed reading lists. These are debates over the academic freedom that academicians find themselves increasingly grappling to reclaim for themselves, from protecting their jobs to protecting their promotions to writing in or to signing in codes of conduct which require them to say that they will not engage in their classrooms activities which are seditious, a term which is a very long old colonial legacy. So in the name of nationalism, patriotism, not only are geopolitical issues being identified right now with the Palestine-Israel conflict, state governments and vice chancellors being asked to articulate from the front the support or for where the Indian political actors are aligning themselves with Israel and discrediting and disallowing any public discussion of the issue, even from a perspective of understanding historically. So it's just one example of that. To the local context of how do you bring an acknowledgement and introduction to students of histories of people's movement within the curricular space. So the few names which have been mentioned here are all writers who talk about either ecological crisis or women's resistance or the experience of the untouchable Dalit women within public domain have been excluded over the years increasingly from the domain of discussion and from formal curriculum. So as I was talking about, these things, so 2014 kind of appears as a watershed moment, but even prior to that, the right-wing students movement was pushing the academic councils of that university to remove or to kind of refer to the sentimentality of or the discourse of hurt sentiments to push one particular agenda of hyper-nationalism to guide academic processes. So since I don't have much time, I would kind of conclude on this part or try to tie up the discussion here that at one level, there is discrediting of the public institution in terms of the quality discourse and efficiency discourse. At the second level, there is an attempt to closely bring into surveillance and public scrutiny the nature of discourse which public institutions are potent to kind of nurture and discredit it. So any discussion on inequality, injustice, crisis, and alternative political viewpoints are presented as a threat to national security and national identity. So alienating the public institution from the public at large in general, And the third is an explicit policy commitment. This is an excerpt from the National Credit Framework. It's a curriculum document which the University Commission has come out with, which says that it proposes it to implement that higher education space would move in this direction. There would be reduction in curriculum and content and reduce everything down to bare core essentials. And this is the site where the direction of resistance is going to emerge from. So the possibility of resistance, which the political actors recognize universities to be, be the sacred space for, very rightly they have identified it, and they're using the curriculum as a site for stymieing critical thinking and critical consciousness from the society. So they use paradoxically the term critical thinking, and they call critical thinking as a skill, but they divorce it from substantive content. They alienate it, or they remove it from even this, or they put it in the direction of saying that we don't need to control the narrative, but we need to discredit the multiple narratives that come from a liberal space of universities. So I think I can conclude here.
Thank you. That's been a really thought-provoking presentation, reflection, and discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to our third speaker this afternoon now, which is Kirsty, who's going to be talking about it's too hard to break into when you haven't got the money, careers prospects of undergraduate conservatoire music students. So Kirsty, over to you.
Thank you. It's very hard to follow those two amazing presentations, but thank you so much. I've learned so much from both of you. And yeah, thank you for being here. For me, it's almost lunchtime, probably just past my lunchtime, so I'm hoping my stomach isn't going to grumble through this. But once we're done, I'm going to have some lunch. But yeah, so want to acknowledge well that this research was a pilot study and funded by SRHE through the Scoping Awards, which was funded when I sort of just fairly recently finished my PhD. I was sort of, trying to develop kind of research projects and potential passions of mine, and I'll talk a little bit about where this came from, because it's a little bit different from where my PhD was, and it was also through quite a transition for me career-wise, and quite tricky. One of the universities that I worked for was shut down, so I had to shift from different places. I'm now at the Royal College of Music in London, but I was at Wolverhampton University. I was at Royal Birmingham Conservatoire whilst trying to finish all this research, so it's followed me for a while, and SRHE were amazing at supporting me through quite a difficult few years, but it was such an important part of my academic profession as well, and developing this area of interest for me. So the research had three main research questions, all related to sort of socioeconomic background of undergraduate music students at conservatoires, and I'll talk about what they are in a second. So I was looking at their prior access to music education before they were studying at higher education, and then I was looking at their experiences during that they're studying. So they were current students reflecting on their experiences. And then I asked them about their career aspirations and imagined futures beyond. So it was sort of the before, the during, and the after. And I'm just going to focus really on that final question, that aspect about career aspirations. But as with all research, it all kind of ties in and is messy and links. But yeah. So music conservatoires in the UK are specialist education providers for music, and there's 9 of them in the UK. You can kind of see them dotted around. There's quite a lot in London, which is interesting data in itself. I'm from the northwest, so I'm yes. So London is very far away from where I grew up. Access is a little bit interesting, what you were saying, Beth. Access to elite mathematics. For music, it's often through audition as well as their exam grades and the usual things, and an interview as well. So these are quite high pressured things, and it depends on the conservatoires of their expectations, but high level of music proficiency on an instrument or composing or music technology or jazz, whatever they're after wanting to apply for, is expected. Therefore, those that have already had access to high level private instrumental tuition will be at a significant advantage in these. And what you were saying, Beth, as well, in mathematics, they'll probably possibly been tutored by teachers that have been to conservatoires and know what to expect, and things like that. So I was the only one in my school that I'd ever gone to a conservatoire, so I almost missed the deadline because it's before all the other applications as well. So if you don't know, you don't know, and you miss out. So in this kind of perspective, in this lens, then music conservatoires are seen as gatekeepers to the classical music industry in this study. So a little bit about me. So I'm from a state school in the northwest of England. I was the first in my family to play a musical instrument. My primary school just said, hey, we can get free music lessons. So you came home with a form and you ticked what instrument you wanted to play. So I ticked the saxophone and they gave me a flute. So I played the flute. So it is just that. That is how it all started. I did eventually play the saxophone, but yeah. I then went and studied composition and writing music at a conservatoire. As my undergrad, I was the only female in the year group, in a couple of year groups actually. But yeah, and then since then I've worked in a wide range of different school settings in around the West Midlands area. I've been involved in education programs that I've been running for a number of years, all around sort of increasing access routes for young people into music. I did my PhD in the School of Education. So that was quite interesting. Had to learn, I'd written a lot of music, not a lot of words. So that was a big transition for me in my PhD, but it was such an amazing experience and I learned so much. And I've been a lecturer at two UK conservatoires now. And I've been a lecturer at a university in a music department as well, which had majority first generation university students. And that was the one that I was there for 9 months, and then they announced the closure of the department because of lack of funding and not enough students. We could talk about that, but I will leave it there for now. So a little bit of background then, a little bit of aspects of literature then. So if we think about equality and diversity in the classical music industry, over recent years, and especially since the pandemic and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, there's been a lot more public discussions around representation in classical music and in the arts and sort of music more generally. However, research shows that it's still, access is still unequal. And although gender, ethnicity playing into and other traits play an intersectional role around access and career paths, research has repeatedly shown that one of the main barriers to music education is the cost of learning an instrument, so somebody's socioeconomic background. So this is why with this particular study, and as it's only a pilot study, we decided just to focus on socioeconomic barriers. But spoilers, as you will see later on, these intersectional aspects played a role in the end, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Witnessing the increasing cuts to music education, both as a teacher, practitioner, and somebody whose school also cut music education after I left, and I was very much concerned around how this would then impact, future career paths and the pipeline into music, the music industry, and applications for universities and conservatoires as well. So these are really lovely, hopeful diagrams here around the decline of music education in schools. So if we look at the numbers of students taking A-level or GCSE music, which are optional subjects between 14 and 18 years old that students can choose to take, and we can see a decline here. The one on the right there, Whitaker and Foltley, they're not foretelling the future. They're sort of recognizing, had the data up until 2021 or 2020, and then they anticipated if the decline carries on as it is, that by 2033 there will be no students taking A-level music. And there's lots of complicated reasons and policy reasons why this is happening, but we don't have time to go into that, but I can always talk about it more. But what we're finding is that this decline in music education has not been felt equally, and that it's pupils from highly deprived backgrounds or state schools have been disproportionately impacted. As an example here, independent schools account for disproportionately higher number of A-level music students, with 20% of A-level music entries only distributed across fewer than 50 schools. So we're getting these little pockets of lots of music happening and students taking A-levels, but they tend to be sort of located around specific schools and independent private schools, which are fee-paying schools. Here, 50% of students at independent, so fee-paying schools, receive sustained music tuition, whereas only 15% of students at state schools get sustained music tuition. And if we look at school orchestras, 85% of independent schools have an orchestra, whereas only 12% from the most deprived areas have one. So we can kind of really see this divide between state schools and private fee-paying schools. So how is this impacting then the conservatoire students, which is where I was working at the time? So privately educated students are overly represented in UK conservatoires, with London conservatoires in particular having some of the lowest number of state school students in the country, not just for music as well. So that's quite worrying. And to kind of put that into perspective, the number of state school students is lower than, say, Oxford and Cambridge when we look at the HESA statistics there as well. Another report by Anna Bull found that about 90% of students at conservatoires are privately educated, so still overly represented there. And only 3.5% of music entrants, so those auditioning, were from highly deprived backgrounds, so very, very small numbers there. It's important to note that different conservatoires, so if I go back to here, vary massively in their uptake, and there's some gaps in the data because some conservatoires are associated with a university, so we can't actually find the data for them because it's sort of all mixed in. So yes, so it's not possible, and it does vary massively actually. Yeah. So if we look at kind of careers then, and the literature around careers in classical music and some of the barriers there, one of the biggest aspects is that people going to study music at these conservatoires are kind of the end point is hope that they would go on to a career in music education, in music, but say performing, composing, arranging, teaching, all these things. But it's very, especially in performing, it's still very highly competitive. We've got a quote here from Bloodworth saying, "A degree in and of itself is not enough to guarantee work." Therefore, if we look at literature from the creative industries, things like unpaid internships feature quite heavily, and we know that this can disadvantage those from working class backgrounds or those that don't have the time and money in industry contacts to be able to take on these unpaid internships. Working conditions as well in the music industry are often informal, precarious, with uncertain employment, low pay, unsociable hours. And this idea, and this comes up in my findings, this idea of the tortured artist is still very prevalent in the creative arts, of that person that is passionate about what they do, but will work for long hours with no or maybe even no pay at all, or very little pay. So there's some of the kind of literature around drawing from music education, equality and diversity in the classical music industry, and part of my study as well looked at sort of teaching and learning in conservatoires, that journey, but I don't touch on that today. So this kind of study then is located at a really pivotal point in a student's development as they progress from formal schooling into thinking about their careers, their pathways, and what's open to them. So this is where this sort of location of the study is. The study involved 2 stages of mixed methodology, and it was drawn from interpretivist, constructivist paradigms. And this mixed methodology approach allowed for both breadth and depth of investigation. But like I say, it's only a pilot study, so it was only a very short project that we could do this within a year. So here's a little bit of information about the students that we sampled. And this is from an online questionnaire. And stage 2 was then 9 semi-structured interviews with current undergraduate students. So I'll let you have a little look at those. Data analysis took a thematic analysis approach following these steps. I think I sort of had about 40 codes, which then I summarised into 7 core themes, which are just down the side for the wider study. Now, if we think about social class and the literature around social class is often quite contested and complex, and not enough time to talk about it all now, but I took Anna Bull's middle class factions as a kind of model for thinking about social class, and drew upon theories of Bourdieu of social economic capital and cultural capital as well in the theorising of this research. So the findings of the study then. So one of the biggest things that came out from, especially from the interviews, was the students' love and passion for music, and their enjoyment. And it often formed a massive part of who they were as a person there growing up, their identity. And as Bull says here, that they invest their whole lives into being a musician. And so often this idea of having a dream of being a musician and being in a career of music. So asking them around what kind of things are they hoping to do, what careers are they hoping to pursue. You can see kind of a mixture of things. Often students listed different aspects around what they would hope to do, which highlights this idea of a portfolio career where it's not just one aspect of orchestral playing, but they might go on to do a bit of teaching, a bit of freelance musician, a bit of community work. But only just over half felt confident that they would make a career in music. And this was highlighted perhaps through the pandemic, which is just after the study took place, just after the pandemic, with students expressing that they felt increased mental health challenges around performing, increased anxiety, and also that the pandemic had exposed how unstable a career in music could be. So this played a really big part in their concerns around the future. One student described the conservatoire sort of like a mini society, that he used it to judge his abilities and compare himself against his other peers. And kind of tied in with that was this idea that the conservatoire could open doors. If we think back to that portfolio career, these 2 students talked about how they thought they would just go and do performing, but actually they love performing non-classical music. They love teaching and community work, and they never thought that was an option for them. So that was really nice. I'm not going to be able to have time to show these, but these are just more detail of those themes. A little story about a couple of students. And finally, the kind of main aspect that came out from these students that I spoke to was this idea that going through the conservatoire, they realised that they would not be able to perhaps have this dream. They'd have to give up on their dream of being a musician, often around the worries of an unstable income and having to sacrifice, say, their mental health, their physical health if they couldn't afford to eat or live in you know, conditions that they would be happy with. Many of the students did share with me how they were stepping away from music to kind of protect their mental well-being and physical well-being, and feeling that it just wasn't for them, but that some of their friends, their peers who were from more affluent backgrounds, who didn't have to worry about that, you know, there was that kind of tension there. So just to kind of round up then, so in terms of their career aspirations, and the Conservatoire could really confirm their dream for them and open doors to other possibilities and other ways of making a career in music. But unfortunately as well, for some, they chose to step away from music as a career. Again, around sort of these financial concerns, but this was very, very difficult for some of the students who had built up the whole identity around being a musician. So this was a really difficult conflict for them. I know Beth mentioned around meritocracy as well. So music and the creative arts often seen as a meritocracy, but these sorts of findings and other research highlight how actually it's those that can afford to stay in the industry for long enough are the ones that will, you know, make it and stay as a making a career in music. Thank you very much. Yeah, I look forward to any comments or questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for an excellent presentation and timekeeping as well. Perfect. So we've got time for questions and comments, reflections and thoughts. So over to anyone here, anything that they would like to ask Kirsty.
Yeah. So I really appreciate the last point, which you mentioned, that meritocracy truly masks structural inequality. I think with a lot of work that the insights that you are sharing, it's incredible how our systems don't recognize it or deliberately kind of work around it, right? That you get admission on the basis of your ability, but how you come to be able, what you were mentioning in the beginning about, you know, the private tutoring, the extra mural support that you get from different, and that's not even accounted for when accounting into your into the processes. So, any insight into where some of the students with from state school system, how do they navigate these choices? How do they overcome this dilemma?
Exactly. So a lot of them shared, because I mean, the sample I was working, the students that were part of the research were those that had got it in. So I haven't been able to talk to those that didn't get into a conservatoire or those that left in that first year. So the wider report talks about that first year of study being very pivotal for them staying or dropping out or choosing, you know, to leave. So a lot of the students that I spoke to and that come from state schools talked about feeling very lucky that they'd had an inspiring music teacher or somebody that just really pushed that forward and provided them with the opportunities that they had around them. But when they got there and got to a conservatoire, they realised, yes, they were very lucky, but actually they lacked a lot of other skills or other things that students had access to that they had not had access to. So one student talks about rehearsing in orchestras, and in his school they had an orchestra and you just turn up and you play and you go home, great. But when he then got to a conservatoire, he turned up to the rehearsal and he hadn't learnt his part beforehand, and he had no idea that he had to do that. He thought he learnt it as part of the group. It's like a social learning. He didn't know he had to spend, you know, hours learning it before he even got to the rehearsal. So that was a very sudden example of how it was just very different for him, and he had to sort of, a lot of some of the students talked about this, either sink or swim. So you either kind of go with it and you catch up and you have that really challenging year, but if they got through that year, they felt better for it. You know, this student talks about actually he's got a huge range of different skills. He used to think he lacked a lot of skills, but actually he was a great jazz player. He played in bands. He was great at teaching. Whereas some of his other students who, yes, maybe performance-wise were, amazing. They lacked some of these other skills. So in the end, although it was really difficult for him, he came away going, actually, I've got loads of other skills because of my experience, and I wouldn't change that. Which was really nice. That was one of the stories that I skimmed through.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments or thoughts for Kirsty at all?
Hi there, Beth here.
Hi, Beth.
Thank you ever so much for that. That was really insightful, and there's lots of parallels actually between what we've been looking at. I was just wondering about music at non-conservatoires. How does the opportunities and pathways differ for people doing music at other universities compared to a conservatoire?
That's a really big question. And the kind of main difference often that is sort of talked about is that in conservatoires it's more performance orientated, so you get more time to practice, be in ensembles, perform, compose, whereas universities sort of like do a little bit of everything. So conservatoire, you specialize from day one. You say, I'm a performer, or I'm a composer, or I'm a pianist or singer. Whereas at university, it's much more broad. You do a bit of everything, and then you might specialize in your third year. Oh, what was the question? Yeah, so about the opportunities. So what some of the real challenges are in that, for example, one of the universities I worked in were students from state school backgrounds, areas of deprivation, first-time university students, doing a lot of work to kind of catch up as well, because they'd not had maybe high quality music education beforehand. But it is like these universities that have been or courses that are in the financial and political context being squeezed, and if we're not getting enough students, or in terms of all the other metrics that were measured against, then they're being closed down. So that was my experience of working in a university where they looked at the data and they said the whole of the performing arts wasn't earning enough money. They had a deficit, so it had to go because it's expensive. Performing arts, you need theatres and specialist one-to-one tutors and instruments and equipment, which other courses didn't need. So that was closed down, and access to these conservatoires for students like I used to work with in Wolverhampton, they would really struggle to get in potentially, but also their experiences there would possibly, they aren't perhaps as set up to support those students yet. There's more to be done at conservatoires to support them, definitely.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you.
Any other final questions for Kirsty at all? Okay. Yeah. If not, we'll pause there. And again, just to say a huge thanks to all our presenters. It's been a really interesting, enjoyable, insightful, reflective session. I've learned a lot just listening to you all, and thank you for your time and preparation. So we're going to pause now. There are sessions starting again at 1:30, which you're very welcome to go to, or lunch, whatever you want to do. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference and have a great afternoon, and take care. And thanks again. And thanks to Susie for keeping us on track and running us in the background. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.